All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Katie. I'm a copywriter here at Talru, and I will be facilitating the Q&A today. So Jeremy, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the first question that was dropped in the chat, which was, how do you suggest working with CFOs who have little understanding about HR or talent management and choose not to learn about those areas or processes?
Great question. So I think there's a couple of things that should probably go through that process. The first is they don't need to understand everything that you do. Don't bother trying to get them to understand everything that you do. They're a CFO. They're probably not like looking to move into HR. So that's not the challenge. The thing that they need to understand is the role that you play and the help that you need and the insight that you can bring to resource allocation. And so that's really the key thing. And so if you start from the language, some of it's about starting from the language they care about, right? So anytime you're trying to sell anybody anything, you want to start from what's in it for them, what's their interest. And odds are, their interest is, how do I make sure that our budget is going to what it needs to help the company achieve its goals? And so if you start not from the perspective of, you don't understand how HR works, let me explain all of our processes to you, like you've lost before you've started. If you start from the perspective of, we have some limitations in the business in terms of the people that we've got staffed, and it's going to limit our revenue, or it's going to cut our profitability, or it's going to handicap us in terms of how we're able to achieve the objectives that you and the CEO and the rest of the executive have told us we have to execute on, then they're going to listen because you're bringing them some insight to help them do their job better. And so I think that's the key thing, is don't try to teach them your job, bring them the information and the expertise that you have to help them do their job better. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to the second question. There's two here that look similar, so I'm going to combine both of them. The first is, could you talk a little bit more about what the cost of vacancy is and how impactful it is to the business? And then also, what is the typical cost for a bad hire?
So cost of a bad hire varies widely from positions. I've seen numbers range from 17 grand to 240 grand. General expected kind of number that I've seen is you should typically expect that to equate to 3 or 4 months worth of labor for the person. Really, what drives that is, what did it cost you to get the hire? So recruitment, marketing, and onboarding. What did it cost you to ramp that hire? Like a more complicated position is going to have more months of learning time, right? And more months of impact. And then what's the total scope of the hire? So if you hired a bad CFO and gave them a $100 million budget, chances are the cost of that bad hire was really high, not just from the cost of having to replace that CFO and what you spent on the recruiter, but also all the bad decisions that came with it, right? So, but in general, when you talk about it from like kind of standard approach, the general number I see is typically around 3 months worth of their salary.
Okay, and then we had Stephen ask, is there a standard budget methodology that most CFOs prefer to utilize? And are guidelines shared with transparency?
Also varies widely by the organization and the CFO. So there are a number of different budget methodologies. I'll kind of probably give you more than you actually care about, but try to keep it short. So a lot of times people will take a top-down budget approach. This is where I think the money should go. And the CEO and the CFO get together and say, here's where that goes. Often an approach that I prefer is to take kind of a ground up methodology where you're actually looking at the unit economics. How much profitability do we make off of every hour of service that we deliver, or every product that we ship, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you kind of look at your volumes and you back into it from that, and then you build an entire organizational model around that. That's a more complicated process that you're more likely to see it, more technologically and financially savvy organizations. And then budget cadence can change a lot too. A lot of organizations, they set the budget, that's the budget for the year, that is what it is, and everybody's stuck to it. Others will have no budget at all. I tend to prefer a method where there's a budget that gets established at the beginning of the year and you hold yourself to that standard and check that standard, but you don't lock yourself in on those decisions. So you go through a monthly or quarterly review process where the team gets together and says, what's happening? And then the executive leadership gets together and says, okay, well, we ran into these issues, let's reallocate some resources. And so that's a cadence change. But also transparency varies a lot from organization to organization. Now, that said, if somebody's not sharing information with you that you need to be able to do your job, most companies have a culture where at least you can go ask and you can set up a conversation. And if it's not your CFO, if you're in a big organization and you don't have access to the CFO, they probably have a financial analyst or somebody like that who you're engaged with as a partner in the finance organization. Set up a lunch, sit down and talk about it. Great question.
Okay. All right. And then our next one is, how do you quantify retention or lack thereof affecting or hurting your recruitment marketing cost?
Great question. So one way to do that would be to kind of get a baseline from prior periods and then try to track what changes there. So if your recruitment marketing budget is $5 million a year and you're spending $5 million a year to bring people in, and your attrition rate is, you have 100 employees and your attrition rate is 20%, you're having to replace 20 employees every year, then you can kind of take that, 20 employees that you have to replace with your recruitment marketing budget. I should have made it 1,000 employees, 200, so call it 200 employees you're trying to replace with that $5 million budget, right? Those employees that you're trying to, probably 10,000. Anyway, you look at that, divide that by the budget, take that budget, and then that tells you what the cost per replacement is. If your attrition rate drops from 20% to 10%, then what should happen is you should need less recruitment marketing dollars. And this is another place where some financial organizations take the approach of, this is your budget, and some department heads respond to that by saying, hey, blow your budget every year so that I can get the same budget next year. That is not a good way to budget. This is not a good way to respond to a budget. And so if you can have a conversation where you say, look, we've reduced our attrition rate, that means I think if you want to blow your CFO's mind, go have a conversation with them and say, in HR, we've made meaningful improvements in employee retention. And as a result of that, we're going to be able to reduce our recruitment marketing budget and still execute on our goals for next year. And we're going to save the organization $2.5 million. By the way, don't expect that this is going to happen every year. We have to maintain this, and we want to set up a budgeting process where it's actually tied to the number of vacancies. And so now you've taken control, impact on your budgeting process. And next year, if that goes back up, the attrition goes back up, then you have to have the candid conversation of, look, we slipped back a little bit. We saved you $2.5 million last year. We're not going to save you $2.5 million this year. This is what we need to do to move forward with the business. And if the business is growing really well and all of a sudden they tell you, hey, we've got to hire 3 times as many people because we're growing, you now have the armament you need to have a conversation that is not based around, hey, yeah, hire 3 times as many people with the same $5 million budget you had a year ago, right? You've already had that conversation and you've engaged in it. So that's a great way for you to take approach to that.
Okay, great. And then Aubrey has another question for us, which was, how do CFOs determine the budget allocated to external recruiting costs?
Great question. Depends a lot on the individual CFO. The way that I would typically look at that is I am pretty much indifferent to external versus internal recruiting, as long as you're looking at it from a marginal basis. So what that means is, if I've got a dedicated recruiter and I'm going to look at that dedicated recruiter and I'm going to think about that recruiter as a comparison to the total amount that it would cost me to recruit with external recruiting activity. And if that dedicated recruiter is saving money, let's say the cost per recruit is $15,000, and we make a decision about whether or not to bring on a dedicated recruiter. Part of what I'm going to look at is, can that dedicated recruiter bring in those candidates for less than the cost of external recruiting? One of those questions is about, what's our volume? One of those questions is about efficiency. If I'm bringing in an internal recruiter and they're spending $20,000 in recruitment marketing and external recruiting, and we didn't see any savings from it, then I'm going to probably ask some questions about why we have an internal recruiter. If that internal recruiter is turning around and they're bringing in 30 or 40 hires and they're doing everything with a $300 CPH, I'm going to look at that and go, wow, it would have cost us $15,000 times 300 people. That internal recruiter has an insanely high ROI, right? And so that's a great question.
Okay, and then we have another question that is, as a small business with financial constraints, what data is valuable to share with leadership about job boards that specialize in highly skilled, specialized roles and reap best talent to gain quality talent and reduce retention?
Great question. So let me parse that for a second. I would say there are a number of different ways that you can approach that. So if it's highly skilled and specific positions with a small business, it gets tough to actually make that a data-driven approach using any of your own internal data, because you don't have a large enough sample set, right? So if you're looking for a very specific specialized role, then job boards may not be easily measurable in terms of the impact on that. And I would say that probably you need to go look at what external costs for those specialized roles to onboard and to recruit and onboard those specialized roles look like. Start with that as a baseline instead of trying to look at your own internal data, because you don't have a big enough sample set. And then you can start to compare your own internal results to that. Now, my answer would be different if it were a bigger company that did have 80 specialized roles getting hired, like 80 of the same specialized roles getting hired. Then you probably have a big enough sample set around that. The other thing is, I'd look at, it may depend on how much commonality there is. You may be able to aggregate if you have an RN and you have an LPN, right? You have two different categories of nurses. Those may be close enough that you can kind of combine those and learn something about the two together.
Okay, and I believe this is our last question. And it is, can there be a budget formula applied and pitched to the CFO where money allocated for staff budget lines are redirected to recruiting in situations where positions are sitting open for several months?
For sure, absolutely. And I think that's a great question. And I think the approach that I would take with that is kind of what we talked about earlier. First, make sure that the positions that are unfilled are actually necessary positions right now. So one thing to be super aware of is you may have a position that's unfilled. It is possible that a CFO looks at it and goes, well, hey, that position's been unfilled for 4 months and we're doing great, right? You may also have a position, and then your conversation may need to be, we're doing great despite that position being unfilled, not because that position is unfilled, right? And then you've got to go through and have that conversation around it. As far as what the budget process would be, again, I'd kind of go back and look at it and say, what is the value that you hope to deliver out of that position? What is the ROI that you expect from that position? And then, again, kind of looking at the examples that we used of the staffing or the trucking worker, go through and show, and you can, again, you don't have to do all the math yourself. You can partner with your CFO, you can partner with your finance representative in your finance organization to build those pro formas. And a lot of times it's really as simple as saying, hey, I've got a position and I really want to understand the ROI around it. Can we make 30 minutes to go through and talk about how this works? And that's how I'd start with that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy, for being here and helping us out with this webinar. Thank you all to everyone who has attended today. If you guys have any further questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. Appreciate having you guys here.
Thank y'all.
All right, bye.